All that government spending during COVID, although necessary, has seriously pushed up those government debt levels. They are levels that haven't been seen since the end of the Second World War. So how will the federal governments pay all that debt back? Simple, they're going to secretly devalue your money. And I'm going to show you what you can do about it. You're watching More Money, let's get it. What's up everyone? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're new, I'm Tay, a 20-year vet of the investment game. I provide a ton of sound and well thought out investment content, kind of like this video where I talk about how to not let the government devalue your money. So to make sure that you don't miss anything, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell so you don't miss a beat. At the end of June 2020, the global total non-financial debt to GDP reached 266%, which means that if we add up all the debt of the government households and the debt of non-financial corporations, it was 2.66 times the global economic activity. In my home country of Canada, home of hockey, beavers, and world leaders who aren't geriatrics, that debt level has skyrocketed to almost 400%. Why does that matter? Well, it's because governments can't continuously take on more debt. Sooner or later, that debt needs to be paid down, which takes away money from future social programs. Interest to service that debt already takes away from social programs. For example, where I live in the province of Ontario, interest costs eat away at approximately 11% of total provincial taxation revenue. So $1 in $10 that the province collects goes to just interest costs to service the debt that we have. So that money could be going to necessary social needs like healthcare, schools, and bailing out billionaire hedge funds. All things that governments typically like to do. So the question is, how does the government pay down these massive amounts of debt? Well, they have 5 tools that they can use, all of which come with massive consequences. And I'm going to explain all of them, but also stick around to the end of the video because I'm going to explain what you can do to protect your wealth. The first tool that governments can use is relying on very real economic growth. Now, if you think about it, the way to measure how indebted a nation is to use a ratio. That ratio is called the debt to GDP. One way to reduce that ratio is to increase the denominator, the GDP part. And the way to do that is you increase GDP by increasing economic activity. And if you think about it intuitively, this makes a lot of sense because the higher the economic activity of a country is, the more the governments can tax that economic activity, and thus you can use that taxation revenues to service more debt. So by drastically increasing the GDP, you'll be able to handle a higher debt load. Just like how if you were to receive a doubling of your salary tomorrow, you'd be able to take on much more debt. This has actually happened in the past, by the way. After the Second World War, it wasn't so much that the federal debt came down, as much as it was that the gross national product actually increased. People just went back to work, and so the GDP just increased as the industrial nations grew significantly. Now, while it is true that when the pandemic is over and everything opens up again, economic activity will significantly pick up, and that's really because of a release of the pent-up demand, especially on Tinder. People will be going on vacations, having weddings, and yes, even LARPing will return. The problem is that there's zero evidence for sustained high levels of economic growth like we saw after the Second World War. So the likelihood of us economically growing out of our high debt levels is not realistic. The second tool that governments can use to pay down national debt is referred to as austerity measures. Austerity measures are when the government significantly reduces government spending and uses that saved cash to pay down public debt. Popular areas that government typically target are pensions of government workers, welfare, and government-sponsored healthcare. They can also target the private savings and investment accounts of the citizens. What we found after the 2008-2009 global financial crisis is that austerity attempted by some governments was socially divisive and seen as socially and politically unacceptable. I actually think you'll get riots and political instability, and the government leaders will be voted out of office. So I don't think austerity measures are even on the table anymore. We've gone way too far past that. The third tool that governments can use is just defaulting on the debt. Hey, if you can't pay for it, don't. The problem here is that because the financial system is so intertwined, a large country like Canada or the US defaulting on their debt will take down the global financial system. All of it. This is because one person's liabilities is another person's assets. Giving you one example would be that a default by the US government would significantly impact and even bankrupt all of the major financial institutions that you work with, i.e. your auto insurer, your bank, your pension fund, because they all hold government debt which they earn interest on to satisfy short-term and long-term obligations. So I have to say, no defaulting on debt allowed, sir. The fourth tool that can be used is called hyperinflation. Now that sounds really cool because it sounds like a new setting on a Tesla model which makes you go way faster than you can ever go before. Truthfully, hyperinflation is a term used to describe when a government purposely or by accident significantly devalues its currency by printing more and more of it. If the country's debt is denominated in paper dollars, the federal government can just print more dollars to pay that debt down. Seems easy, right? Well, the paper dollars numbers only reflect the health and confidence in the economy. The strength of the economy largely does not change depending on if you print more money. So if you have more paper dollars out there, they just represent a smaller and smaller piece of the economic pie of that country. And thus it'll require more and more dollars to purchase assets and products such as basic goods like food and fuel. So hyperinflation makes your dollars worth less, and it costs more dollars to purchase basic goods. Hyperinflation is different from inflation because hyperinflation is generally inflation rising at faster than 50% a month. So they are printing so much money that your money loses half of its value each month. Basically, people who have experienced hyperinflationary economies essentially spend their money as soon as they get it. You don't want to hold any of that money because it's going to devalue by half every month. Hyperinflation will cause serious damage to the financial markets and society. It will significantly damage an economy, and thus politicians will not dare go near it. Unless it's done through policy error, and I hate to say it, it's entirely possible. The fifth tool, and it's the least scariest one, but the scariest sounding one, is called financial repression. In its simplest form, financial repression involves the creation of much higher inflation than we currently have, but not hyperinflation, while simultaneously preventing a rise in either the short-term or long-term interest rates. The idea here is to keep the costs of debt low while the economy measured in nominal dollars is growing rapidly, aka the debt to GDP ratio. So the idea here is that the economy is not actually growing rapidly, but because the currency is being devalued and GDP is measured in nominal dollars, it only looks like the economy is growing rapidly, that GDP figure, and because the debt stays relatively the same, if you have the GDP figure growing rapidly, that debt to GDP ratio becomes lower as time goes on. The net impact of this, however, is eroding the purchasing power of savers by giving them low interest rates while keeping inflation high. Effectively, you're taxing people who have cash saved and invested in low interest rate securities. As much as this sounds like a horrible option, it seems like it's the only option that governments have left. Now, before I go into what you can do about this, if I brought to you any value from this video thus far, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Also, my next video will be about how you can generate 7 really good passive income streams to beat out the coming high inflation levels. So if you don't want to miss out on that video, please hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell to be notified when I upload that video. So how do you deal with financial repression? Well, the good news is you've come to the right guy. I'll give you 3 ways that you can avoid financial repression. Number 1, do not invest in government bonds or government bond-like instruments like high interest savings accounts, treasury bills, and the like. The interest rates on these instruments will be so low that inflation will eat away at your purchasing power. Number 2, if you're a business with really good cash flow, you should borrow at fixed rates for as far as you can. You can invest that into real income generating assets and over time pay that debt down, which will be significantly reduced in real dollar terms due to inflation. Number 3, if you're an individual, consider purchasing reasonably priced real estate using very long-term debt at the current low interest rates. Over time, your property values will likely continue to increase at the value of at least inflation, and your mortgage will be devalued due to the higher rates of inflation. Also, if you're an individual with cash savings, deploy that cash into assets that stand a chance to appreciate in line with inflation. Your best bet to always beat inflation is by investing it in companies that can raise their prices at a rate that's higher than inflation. Google is that type of company, so is Apple, so is Coca-Cola. If you want to know how I managed to not pay down my student debt, click over here. If you want to know how a guy turned 50K into 50 million with his GameStop investments, click over here. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you later.